Good afternoon, everyone. It is Tuesday. It is 3 p.m. ET, and you wonderful, wise people have found us here at a special edition of Crime Time on A Mighty Blaze. And we are so happy that you are with us today for an incredibly special guest. Let me quickly tell you, I am your host, Hank Phillippi Ryan, the USA Today bestselling author of 13 going on 14 novels. My newest is Her Perfect Life, which is so casually displayed on the door behind me. And my new one, The House Guest, is sort of Gaslight meets Thelma and Louise. And that comes out in February. And you will hear about that when the time comes. But today, let me tell you, I am beyond, obviously babblingly, speechlessly honored to be able to introduce you to Laurie R. King, who is, and I get to use the word icon, and she's not going to stop me, but an absolute icon. And her new book, Back to the Garden, is out today. So this is launch day for Back to the Garden. It's groundbreaking in so many ways, with a brand new character, a brand new detective, a brand new milieu, a brand new everything. And I can tell you all that this is engaging and fun and so intelligent and wise and smart, and every bit of dialogue is gorgeous and the setting is gorgeous. And now I'm just completely babbling, but I love this book. Ooh, and it has Kleenex hanging from it too. It's a decoration. I love this book, and I cannot wait to have Laurie tell us all about it. Laurie, happy Pub Day.
Oh, thank you, Hank.
Does it ever get old to having a pub day?
No. I mean, it's always fabulous, and it's lovely this year because little by little we can begin to creep out of our virtual. I mean, it's lovely to see you virtually because I would never see you. I mean, I'm not flying to Boston today, but it's exciting because we haven't done this in a while, and there's 3D people out there waiting for me.
It's you look at all the people. Speaking of people waiting for you, Sherry is here today. Sherry Steuben and Shannon Hansen and Judy Morris and Joanne Broberg is here, and Diane. So many people are here to greet you and welcome this brand new book with a brand new character. And I'm going to talk to you about that in a minute. But if you are new to Crime Time, if you are new to A Mighty Blaze, you have picked a really good day to be here. A Mighty Blaze was started at the beginning of the pandemic by the fabulous powerhouse duo of Jenna Blum and Caroline Levitt to keep us discovering new books and to keep us reading and discovering new authors and getting to know our favorite authors, which is what we are doing today. So we welcome you all to A Mighty Blaze. Let me introduce our author today with her formal bio, in case you don't know Laurie R. King, but of course you do. Shannon is here and Sherry and Judy, yay. Laurie R. King is the award-winning best-selling author of 17 Mary Russell mysteries, 5 contemporary novels featuring Kate Marinelli, and many acclaimed standalone novels such as Folly, Touchstone, The Bones of Paris, and Lockdown. You all know this. You know this. Laurie is an Edgar Award winner and was also named the 2022 Grand Master by Mystery Writers of America, which is that's the highest honor you can possibly get, the acclaim and the admiration and the adulation and the reverence for a body of work, and also a body of an author that is still going absolutely strong, as you can read in Back to the Garden, which came out today. She lives in Northern California, and you will be pleased to know that she is hard at work, she says, on another Mary Russell mystery. But first today, let's talk about Back to the Garden, which brings us, Mary Alice is saying, happy Pub Day from Los Angeles. So love this novel. I do too. Talk about, this is a new main character. Tell us about Inspector Lang.
Yes, Raquel Lang is I think what happens when when you have to decide after 3 years of lockdown, do you want to do you want to go crazy and do something really new, or do you want to do the same thing? And you think, yeah, I need to get out there. And I don't know about you, Hank, but I found it really difficult during the 3 years that passed to do anything really, really new. I found that I was tending to read my old friends. I was fitting into sort of comfortable niches when it came to, all the sort of ingrained habits. And when time came to do a new book, I was on track to do another Russell and Holmes. The problem was that I can't travel when the world is shut. And the Russell and Holmes books require me to travel because they're all move around the world, and I had to do research. It's really tough doing research in places like Paris and Kyoto. I mean, I know how much your heart sinks when you think,
We rely on you for it. Somebody has to do the hard research.
you know. So I thought, well, if I can't travel and I'm looking for something different, maybe I should look closer to home, but with a whole new kind of character. I've had a lot of people wish that I would write another Kate Martinelli.
Mm-hmm.
The problem being that, the last time I wrote a novel was 2006 or 8. I mean, that's a long time ago for having a series that has that much of a gap in it. But I thought, what if I take some of the elements of the Martinelli stories that I really enjoyed? That is, writing San Francisco, writing the San Francisco Police Department, and build them into a new character. And so that's where we started. I started with the idea of a young woman who is in the cold case, because I wanted to write a two-part story, part in the past and part in the present. And that fits with the whole cold case thing of the two stories that seem to be separate, but you hope as a reader and and as a writer, you hope that they come together, because the stories are more interesting if they're not just two parallel tales. So that's sort of where Raquel came from. She stepped into the cold case. She's not there permanently, but she has some kind of enigmatic reason why she's there that it's never really totally clear, but obviously got into trouble somehow. And she has these incredible skills that are oddly like those of this other detective that we know, this guy named Holmes.
I did notice that. I did notice that. And
Yeah.
I love it. It makes her so endearing. But let's go back a little bit, because as an author, you gave yourself the task of creating an entirely new character with an entirely new background and present time and a potential future. How do you create someone like Raquel Lang out of essentially nothing but your own imagination?
Raquel was really interesting. That I'm what's known as an organic writer. You can call me a pantser, but it's as somebody who doesn't write to an outline. And when I start a book, I have certain sort of posts that I'm working around. That is, I wanted to make a young-ish woman character, and I wanted to do the cold case, and I wanted to set it partly in a sort of hippie commune. And working from there, I started doing the first draft. And my first drafts tend to be very rough. I never show them to anyone except my editor, and even she kind of winces when she sees them. She's very polite. But I thought that when I started in on the second draft, I would be filling in a lot of the background of this character. And I was fascinated by how recalcitrant she proved of having herself explained. That she really is. Enigma is a part of her personality. And I had a lot of fun when I realized that. I had a lot of fun playing with it, of how much can you not say about your protagonist and still make her vivid and alive?
Well, she is so vivid and alive. From the first moment that she speaks, we begin to know her and like her and hear her tone of voice, her way of looking at the world. I mean, two things about it. One is if I met someone new and we went out to lunch, I wouldn't expect them to tell me their entire life story before they told me something new. So I'm open to hear something new happening before I hear every single thing that possibly could affect her personality. So I thought it was lovely to meet Raquel and to get to know her a little bit. We do know her from how she speaks and how she sees the world, and how she sees the world is sort of Holmesy, and she's got this super intuition. She can really read people, body language, micro expressions. She judges people, and then she's great at doing what she thinks they need in order to get what she wants. Is that right? And talk a little bit about how you developed that.
Yeah. I, there's a sort of, I don't know if you can call it a science, but there's a developed approach to getting at the truth in an interrogation that is based on the idea that when you are questioning someone, they have these involuntary and very, very brief expressions that flicker over their face that tell you a lot more than what their words contain. Most of the use of this is done with film. I mean, people are videoed, and you can slow the video down so that you see these, 1/32 of a second of contempt or fear or anger that is straight out of the subconscious and doesn't really enter into the person's mind at all, but is betraying what they really are thinking. And I found that so fascinating, of the idea that you can read someone despite themselves, that I wanted to make that the sort of scientific basis of what Raquel Lang does, that she's made a study of it, that she's extremely good at it, that she can do it without putting it on film. And that's the kind of basis of where she comes from, is somebody who is so tuned in to what the other person is saying despite themselves that she can get at the truth underneath what they're telling you.
And she's very good at it, and she uses it, not unlike Sherlock Holmes, who wouldn't have called it that, but still has that same way of reading people and clues. I'll tell you a secret, just because it's us. Sometimes when I'm watching the news, I'll watch the anchor person who isn't talking. Try it. It's pretty interesting. And those micro expressions come across very, very clearly. Let's go. You said that you were an organic writer, but let's talk about basically the plot of Back to the Garden, so people know a little bit of what's between the covers of this book.
Well, this is not a typical sort of pantser, right? Because with a book that has two separate timelines going on, you have to tie them together in a way that is tight enough that you don't lose your reader. And when you're doing the first draft of something, you're just trying to get the mechanics of the plot out there so that all the pieces fit together, they turn in the way you want, and they come out in a way that is useful. I tended to write this kind of in the sequence that you find them in the book, but a lot of it I was also making notes of, okay, we learned this here, but you need to actually learn the rest of it here. So there's a lot more deliberate craft, I think, in this book than in some of the narratives that start at the beginning and go straight through to the end. I mean, obviously they have craft in them, but this one took a lot more deliberately fitting them together, and a lot of feedback from my editor and her right hand person. I mean, I find I can't write a book without feedback early on from an editor, and in this case, it was really helpful to know where they saw the story as going and what they thought I had said in the first draft.
I mean, it's interesting because for something that, you're talking about doing this very deliberately in the dual timelines, and I want you to tell us about the dual timelines and the place, but it comes across to the reader as incredibly seamless, as incredibly effortless. It's so much fun to be reading this book, and I sort of felt myself putting the little puzzle pieces in place of then and now, and you make that seem so effortless. So it's fascinating to hear how carefully it was done. Tell us
Thank
a
you.
little bit about each timeline.
Well, there's the modern day, of course, which is pretty much now. It doesn't mention COVID much, other than vague references to the economic impact on the Gardner estate where it's set over the last few years. So I mean, that's always been something that those of us who write contemporary stuff have to worry about is, what are we going to do about COVID? Do we really want to go into the details? Are we hoping that by the time the book is finished and published that it'll all be over with? So it's my choice with this one is a modern life that was a little more optimistic when it comes to pandemics. But there's also a timeline that is in the 70s, because the main character, Raquel Lang, is working for, as I said, the cold case unit of the San Francisco Police Department. And bones come to light underneath a sculpture on the Gardner estate that was installed roughly 50 years ago, the late 70s. And she thinks it might be the work of a serial killer that she and her partner are investigating. But she has to look at what was going on the estate at the time. So you have the timeline that starts in 1972, when the young man who will inherit the estate comes home from Vietnam. You then have a section in 1975 where he is living in Oregon and on a commune, followed by a period where they move the commune down to the Gardner estate. And then there's a section that is in 1979 where it's the final days of the commune and this big rock festival that is going on. So you follow the 70s, and I mean, the 70s were an interesting time because you went from the great optimism, free love, the pill. We were changing the world with our organic farms. We were going to make a new society. That was the 60s. Into the 80s that had crack cocaine and AIDS and women in big shoulder pads, edging their way into the corporate world, and that was the goal. So the 70s were this time between one era and another. And I found it really interesting to write that time because it's got its own sort of innate tension of the feeling that things are ending.
I mean, I love that it's not a 60s book. It's sort of a result of the 60s book and this transition to the 70s, which was really a fascinating time when so many of us really came of age into being an adult in the 70s. How did you research the 70s? How did you go back to that?
Yeah, the old saying of, if you can remember the 60s, then you weren't there. Yeah, I mean, you obviously have to do research because your memory doesn't necessarily know where to lodge things unless there's a reason that you remember, that's the dress I wore when I went to that event, and that was in 1974. But for the most part, there's this sort of broad memories of that age, and you have to look them up and find that no, nobody shopped at Safeway then. It was the Alpha Beta Market, and you know, what kinds of phones, and obviously we were far from cell phones, but what what were the clothes that we wore? Was that yet into the wide pants and pale polyester of that you think of as disco, or were we still kind of in between? One of the advantages of setting something on a commune is that basically I live in Santa Cruz County, and it's kind of what Santa Cruz is. I mean, we never really came out of the 60s. So, my research is going down to the center of town, and they think, oh yeah, I remember that.
Well, I mean, it was interesting to see how authentic it felt to me. And when you said 50 years ago, I thought, oh, really? It was, okay, fine. Although, we don't know what history is when we're in it.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to remember it's hard to know what to remember and hard to know what's important at the time. Although I did work in Washington, D.C. during Watergate on Capitol Hill. So I do remember that. So cold cases are this cold case, this Raquel looking into a serial killer who you up the tension so gorgeously because he might die now at any moment and it might be too late. Talk a little bit about that suspense and what it is about cold cases and serial killers and why that's so endlessly fascinating. And was this based on a true person?
Well, oddly enough, it kind of runs parallel to a case that was coming to light as I was putting the book together. Joseph DeAngelo was a cop who went from break-ins to rapes to murders during roughly the same period of the 70s and the late 70s, early 80s. And because he moved around a lot and because he was a cop, they didn't catch him until just a few years ago. So it's kind of parallel to that, although this is not based on him. It was just sort of coincidence that it would come up. But one of the interesting questions that came into the mix when I asked my beta readers for suggestions of discussion questions, because we do a book club kit that's attached to the book page. And one of those questions I found really fascinating, that someone said, in this day and age where police departments are having their funding cut right and left, what justifies spending time and money on a cold case investigation? And I found that so fascinating to think of, because the idea that people get away with it permanently is offensive, deeply offensive, not only to all right-thinking people, but certainly to the families. It must be horrendous to never know, to never have any kind of closure. And so cold cases matter. They matter as a sort of mark of our humanity. And I think that to have somebody like Raquel, who believes that in her bones, so deeply that she doesn't really have to stop and think about it, that it is wrong to allow somebody to just die of natural causes without pinning something to him before he goes.
Without having him take responsibility for that and having that knowledge. She's so determined about it and so straightforward about it and so gorgeously honest about her devotion to justice. Mm-hmm. Justice is a big theme. Oh, and I see that our fabulous Margaret Bernard is putting your book club kit, the link to the book club kit, in our chat comment. So that's great. So don't go right now, you all, but after this is over, go look at the questions. Talk a little bit about the search for justice and why that's important to Raquel as far as we know, and why that's such a riveting turning point of this book.
It's interesting when you have a character who is not really connected that closely with humanity as a part of her emotional family, but who feels that she has commitments to the way the universe runs. And one of those is, if I don't stand up for people who need help, who will? It's so basic to our genre, isn't it? I mean, even noir stories where the protagonist doesn't usually win. Even those acknowledge that justice is vital to a society that works, that cares, that functions. And to have someone who dedicates herself, hand and foot to setting things right. You'd like to think that all police departments and all human beings would walk in those shoes.
And that's why it's so wonderful that you provide Raquel Lang. We're talking about, you just arrived, you lucky people. We're talking about Back to the Garden, Laurie King's new book starring Raquel Lang, who is seconded to a cold case squad in San Francisco and looking into a person who may have been a serial killer in the 50s, 50 years ago in the 70s. And she is tracking down perhaps one of his victims. The setting where this takes place is so gorgeous. This incredibly beautiful at one time art sculpture garden, beautiful house, beautiful garden that has had many incarnations, including as a commune. Was that based on a specific place? Talk a little bit about this place.
Oh yeah, it's it's fun to take a real place and just change it. So I think we all face that when we set a story in a city, but we really need a one-way road here. We just kind of sneak it in, and sometimes you put a note at the end saying, "Sorry about that one-way road. I know that it's not really there." The Gardner estate is very, very loosely based on a place called Filoli, which is about 25 miles south of San Francisco along the peninsula. Filoli was built in the 20s. It was a formal country house from a family. They had a formal garden, and it's roughly in the same place that the Gardner estate is. But I didn't want to use the actual estate for any number of reasons, But I wanted to sort of base it on the same idea of what a house like that would be, where it would come from, who would have built it, what it would have been used for. And I loved the idea of having it held by these capitalists who then, risking spoilers here, the young man who takes it over wants to sort of go the absolute opposite direction and turns it over to his commune. And they rip out all the formal gardens and put in vegetable beds and all the rest. And it's so like what was going on in the 60s. I mean, there were a number of places around California, as you might imagine, that were converted into group homes and communes. And this was the thing that I loved about the idea of taking a formal garden and making it into something where you grow beans and zucchini.
And where the rules are different and where the goals are different, and this closed society where the rules have to evolve for themselves, the goal being everybody's happy and everybody's peaceful. And that was rarely successful.
Yeah, it's Communes took a lot of work, and I think especially a lot of them started falling apart when the next generation came along. I mean, if you think about it, if you have a kid, do you really want him to be raised in that situation all the time? And it's really difficult, the difference between people who don't have children and people who do. The kinds of responsibilities and goals that you have take a huge shift. So a lot of the communes started falling apart when people had kids, and kids have needs.
And it's interesting how you have built, and you all can find this on Laurie's website so perfectly, this gorgeous genealogy of the family that had the Gardner estate,
Yeah.
and how you created the family tree. Was that fun to do? Talk a little bit about that. I mean, it felt so real to me. I kept thinking, are these real people? These have got to be real people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of those areas where you have to keep fiddling with the dates, and you think, well, we can't have him too old there, so maybe I should make him born. And then this guy has to die here, so we have to shift him back a little bit. And so, yeah, it was a lot of scratching out and pencil marks on the thing until I found one that actually worked. But
Well,
yeah,
go ahead.
yeah, it's fun to do stuff like that, and I love Random House being willing to play with it and make, as you said, it's part of the book club kit, as you can play with this. So.
Well, I want to read you all the first line of the first chapter marked now. And you tell me, you all, if you don't think this is one of the best lines ever. The day had been going so well until the bones turned up. I love that, Laurie. Was that always the first line of chapter 1?
Yeah. I mean, you've had a sort of brief series of setups of the characters that you're going to meet, and just because I didn't want it to start entirely with Jen, but yeah, I wanted to shift it from the idea that's kind of dark and this guy lying in his hospital bed and the rest of it, but I wanted it to be this community of people on the Gardner estate who work together as a crew and are having a lovely, lovely April spring day with a work party, and it was going so well, and then
well, and it's just your tone. It's the tone. It sets the tone for the whole book. Or when Raquel Lang, your new character, who we adore, doesn't know what wisteria is and doesn't know exactly who this artist who did a lot of the sculptures is. She has these gaps in her otherwise brilliant knowledge, which is again sort of you've made her quirky and wonderful and fabulous. Speaking of which, I have not stopped singing this Woodstock since I saw your title, Back to the Garden. Talk a little bit about why this is indeed the perfect title on so many levels, not only hippies, but the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, I was very pleased that it hasn't been used 200 times for novels, because I mean, that obviously it has been used at some point, but far enough ago that I could make use of it. I wanted the garden idea to be central to the whole book, partly because of the estate. The name of the family is Gardner, and partly because you can introduce the idea of the Garden of Eden with not only Adam and Eve, but you also have Cain and Abel. So you have these questions of who's responsible for what, where the serpent comes in, and that as soon as the statues of Eve and Adam and the two boys appear, this is not something that the author is going to waste. So a garden is such a lovely self-enclosed place that is vulnerable to outside threat, and that, I think, the fact that the Joni Mitchell Crosby, Stills, Nash song reverberates in your mind, I think is not accidental.
I mean, we are stardust, we are golden, and then we are caught in the devil's bargain. It's just so gorgeously Wonderful. Are you, I mean, we're wrapping up here and I want to take some questions in a minute, but I do wonder, you know, you created this new character, Raquel Lang, and I can't imagine that we're not going to see her again. Please tell me we are. How do you feel about all of the, I mean, tremendously enthusiastic buzz about her? Did you get connected with her as well?
I'm really pleased that people like her. You always, especially when you are trying something a little different, you always want your publisher happy, because it means that they, when you come back to them and say, so about another in that series, they don't say, they say, yeah, okay, that works for us. So yeah, I was very pleased that that the reviews and the enthusiasm of the fans and so forth has been positive. And I think as the beginning of a series, I really like the fact that you don't learn everything about her in the one book, that it leaves all these doors for me as a writer to explore and to look at. And not only Raquel herself, but I really want to get into this mysterious sister of hers and what she's doing in her global virtual community.
Well, I love all the little possibilities that you planted in Back to the Garden. It is a marvelous, wonderful, seamless book, which I will not stop babbling about how much I really enjoyed this. I love your voice. I love the story. I love your style. I love how smart this book is, the layers and layers of knowledge that seamlessly go into it. What a treat to read, and congratulations on this and on your pub day, Laurie. It's marvelous. People are clamoring to ask you questions. So let's take a couple of questions. Renee says, hey, Renee, how do you write two different timelines without plotting to some degree?
Well, I think I am plotting to some degree. I think that I am convinced that those of us who don't write to an external outline, we are not outliners. I am convinced that we have an outline back here in the back of our head, that there is some sense of the structure and the needs of that particular story that is just not on a separate piece of paper or post-its or a whiteboard or whatever people use for their outlines. Because I know that when I'm writing, I often get the sense that it's going to plan, even though I don't know what the plan is. I mean, that sounds particularly insane, but in fact, I think that some of us have learned to write by absorbing the storytelling art rather than thinking about it. And I'm one of those.
I mean, I agree. You know how to tell a story and sort of what kind of has to happen, and the rhythm and the music of how a Once Upon a Time has to be.
Yeah. And the rewrite is to get it right. Yeah. You know, the rewrite is where you see all these pieces that don't actually fit together correctly, but you know where the story needs to go, and that's where the thing comes in.
Or the super joy of finding the things that you didn't realize that you put in there, that are there for some gorgeous reason that you didn't plan. I mean, that's the magic. That's one of the bits of magic of it that I know that you know all too well. Who else has a great question? Vicky says, did you take micro expression training?
No, not directly. I mean, in some ways it would be interesting, and others I think it would be kind of a waste of everyone's time. I need to know enough how it works to know how it would work for her. But again, I sort of want the freedom to allow the story to develop its own way, kind of like the Gardner estate itself. I didn't want to be tied into a set of architectural plans that already existed. And
do you know George R.R. Martin doesn't call them plotters and pantsers? I just realized this. He calls them architects and gardeners.
Yeah.
And isn't that perfect that you're a gardener as you write? It couldn't be.
I mean, I call them organic and organized.
Oh, I love that. Also good. Also good. Who else has a question? I see many. Okay, I love the title. Was it always the title? Shannon is saying.
I think this was one that had a sort of generic working title of Cold Case to start out with.
Super.
And, I mean, that was, I as a title, it was not really adequate, but it sort of gave me something to work towards. But as it developed and I started really focusing in on the gardener garden, I realized that's where I wanted it to go. I wanted that warmth and texture of a garden rather than just the cold rigidity of a cold case.
But how did you find how did the song emerge to you? I mean, you couldn't go searching for it.
Well, I don't think that it was the song that brought the title. I think that it was the idea of in the commune era, the whole goal was to go back to the garden, was to go back to a state where human beings had a degree of innocence and responsibility towards their fellows, before they were kicked out and there were murders and you had to conquer the earth. So I think that the idea of going back into the garden came before the song. But obviously you can't write a book called Back to the Garden that doesn't evoke that tune.
No, absolutely not. Especially for those of us of a certain era, which is completely marvelous. We are running out of time. Thank you so much, Laurie King, before we give away and spin the wheel of fun, for giving us.
I have one to send to people, so you can keep yours, and I will send this to people. I'll sign it.
I was going to say, I'm not giving, this is mine, and I am not giving this up, plus, especially since I marked all the way through it, sadly. Renee has a perfect final question, which is, how do you celebrate after you finally finish writing a book? I guess when you see the real book, because that means it is finished.
Yeah, because I mean, you finish writing and then you do the rewrite and then you finish that and then you do the copy edit and you finish that and then you do the proof pages and you finish that and then you have all these bits and pieces that kind of drag on, and by that time you're in the next book. And so I think that a launch day is where you really celebrate. So I celebrate with my host Hank Phillippi Ryan and Crime Time. I celebrate with my launch event tonight and the events that I'm doing this week. And so I celebrate.
Okay. And you can find all of those events on Laurie's website, is the word I'm searching for so unsuccessfully. You can find all those events on Laurie's website and on Facebook and on every bit of social media where you can follow her and find out all about Back to the Garden. And one lucky commenter will now be winning a copy of this. Let us spin the wheel of fun. This is so great. And we will see who has won a copy of this. Look at all the people who came. This is great. Love this. And we should be humming Back to the Garden. And the winner is Janice Cromby Cross.
Fantastic. Cross. Whee!
Isn't that so great? I love that. I don't think you've ever won a book here before, Janice. So that is marvelous. And you will see the instructions of how to get your very own copy of Back to the Garden in the comments. Laurie, congratulations. We are so honored that you are here today. Any last words for Crime Time on your pub day of Back to the Garden?
I love what you do in building community. It's so funny the way that the mystery world has this very close and affectionate and supportive community, considering that we deal with dead bodies.
That is true. Well, we are so pleased to be able to talk with you about Back to the Garden, where there may or may not be bodies buried, but we love reading about it. And thank you for a marvelous book. Happy Pub Day and happy everything to you all who are listening to Crime Time today. You know, this has been a special edition of it so we could get Laurie King on our show. Coming up in about 15 minutes, we will have our 4 o'clock show with Tara Moss, whose marvelous World War II novel, The Ghosts of Paris, is evocative and atmospheric. And look at Billy Walker on the cover. It is a fantastic book. I think these little markings on the front are on my iPad. They're not on the cover. I'll show you the real cover when Tara comes and joins us in about 15 minutes. So you all go get a cup of tea, get a cup of coffee, get a glass of wine, if that's your timing. And we will see you in about 15 minutes. Laurie, congratulations. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
And we will see you all in about 15 minutes. See you then.